So I watched this movie, a documentary about 20 years ago called What the Bleep Do We Know? And at the time, I mean, I was quite fascinated with it, but at the time, it was absolutely ridiculed, kind of dismissed as scientifically invalid, woo woo, whatever, magical thinking. And because the premise of this video was that our thoughts shape our reality. And now we know that to be true. And it's interesting that, this concept that what we think, how we think, shapes our life is not new. 2,000 years ago, Marcus Aurelius, a Stoic philosopher, you might have heard of, he actually said the quality of our life, and I'm paraphrasing here, the quality of our life is dependent on the quality of our thoughts. And even Shakespeare in Hamlet says, nothing is either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. So if we are to start, getting unstuck, working through our psychological or emotional difficulties, we really need to start managing our own thoughts, because our thoughts do create our reality. And it isn't woo-woo. I'm going to explain, how this happens. So if you've watched some of my earlier videos, you know a little bit about schemas now. And a schema is a pattern in the brain and nervous system that consists of thoughts that then generate emotions. And those emotions kind of push us to act in certain ways, which are often very unhelpful. So in this video, I'm just going to look at how do we start kind of dealing with our thoughts, especially our negative thoughts. So first of all, I'm just going to talk about, how our thoughts create different emotional states. So when we think, and I'm talking mostly about negative thoughts now, when we have some kind of negative thought, the amygdala activates an emotional response, and that response changes our neurochemistry and can put us into a fight flight state. So an example, you'll all know examples of this. You could be out in a social gathering and you notice somebody kind of looking at you, intently. And how you feel about that depends on the story that you tell yourself about the way that person is looking at you. And often with our thoughts, we don't question them. We just believe that they are 100% true. So you might be sitting there going, that person's judging me. He's thinking that, or she's thinking that, there's something wrong with me. Maybe it's my clothes. Maybe, maybe I've said something. And then you tell the story to yourself about what this other person is thinking. You assume it to be true. And then this can start to either really wind you up and get angry or become very anxious. So depending on the story that you tell yourself, you might either, go over and attack them verbally or something, or sometimes people do it physically. I remember growing up in Swansea, if you looked at somebody the wrong way, they might punch you because you're like, what are you looking at? You might just be staring into the distance. So the stories that we tell ourselves generate an emotional response, and that emotional response dictates often a course of action we might take. So just different examples, you might have somebody at work ask you to give a presentation on something, and this presentation could be, an opportunity for promotion for you, but you start ruminating over what is going to happen in the future. Your thoughts start telling you how the future is going to play out. Now, and this is likely to be, they're gonna realize they don't know what I'm talking about. I can't do it. It's going to be a disaster. And the more you tell yourself this, the more stressed and anxious you become. the more kind of narrow your thinking becomes, because once you go into a fight flight state, your thinking becomes very kind of tunnel vision, and you just become hyper focused on the end disastrous outcome. So by then you might have got so worked up that you go into the presentation and you freeze, and then you like it just feeds back and you're like, oh, see, I knew I couldn't do it. Or if you, I don't know, notice somebody that you want to start a relationship with, but the story that you tell yourself is, I'm going to be rejected, they don't like me, I'm not good enough, and then you don't take the opportunity. So it's really important to start looking at what thoughts that you have that could be playing into difficulties that you have, which then keep you stuck. Other examples might be, with unrelenting standard schema, the thoughts around that are, oh, this isn't good enough, I need to do it better, I need to do more. And setting such high standards for yourself that you end up procrastinating and stuck. So think about, your thoughts. And often we're not even able to kind of take a step back from our thoughts, because the ability to do this, the ability to go, hang on a minute now, what story am I telling myself here? And what is that? How is that story impacting my life? We often don't do this because we just assume that what we think is true. And it's not true necessarily. Or if it is true, it might not be a really helpful story to tell yourself. But the skill that we need to be able to observe our own thoughts is a skill called mentalizing. And this skill is very much part of the prefrontal cortex. And it can be very, very underdeveloped. So we just get literally, I call it fused. We get fused to our own thoughts. We don't question our own thoughts. And these thoughts just run away with us. It could be the catastrophizing what if thoughts, about anything. What if this happens? What if that happens? We as human beings, we have a negativity bias. So our thoughts tend to go towards the negative. Now I heard this statistic that 90% of the thoughts that we have every day are pretty much the same as the day before. And 70% or a large percentage are actually negative. And if we monitored our own thoughts, it'd be interesting to see, where they're going. So if you think about your day, get in the car and go, why is he doing that? Why is that person doing this? I can't believe they cut me up. You get into work and you're like, oh, I'm a bit late, or they're all looking at me. Oh, it's we get lost in our own head, and even when we're on our own, our thoughts can be quite distressing if we're thinking about like, oh, where's my life going? I'm a failure. I shouldn't have done this. I shouldn't have done that. Imagine it's like having somebody in our head that's given a running commentary on how bad we are, how bad other people are, or how bad life is. It's torturous. And once we understand how impactful our thoughts are, that's often the first step to change. So going back to this skill of mentalizing, we need to have this skill, and a lot of psychological issues that we have, like anxiety, depression, anger, are because we are fused to our thoughts. We believe our thoughts to be 100% true. If we have the thoughts that I'm a failure, we believe that. We don't actually think this is just a thought. And a thought, and I need to distinguish here between conscious and unconscious. An unconscious thought are these automatic churning voices in our head that have actually been input into us through our childhood experiences. So as children, if we receive messages that we're not good enough, that we're a failure, that we don't belong, that we're defective in some way, these what we call core beliefs that exist in our subconscious then just activate these constant stories. So what we need to start doing is to first take a step back. So when we find ourselves in some kind of rumination, which is kind of thought looping, or when we find ourselves having anxiety, or when we find ourselves getting really wound up and angry, we need to be able to take a step back and start looking inwards. And a lot of, it's actually not an easy thing to do because we don't like looking at our own thoughts, I mean, there was an experiment once looking at thoughts, and the experiment was people were given a choice to sit in a room with absolutely nothing, no distractions, no nothing, just their own thoughts, or have a mild electric shock. And the majority of people chose the electric shock because people don't like to be alone with their own thoughts, especially, these days now. I mean, it's interesting. This is another thing to look at is we go about our day and we have to constantly look at our phone. I mean, it just becomes automatic. We don't sit with our own thoughts in reflection anymore, and the more difficult kind of thoughts that we have, the more we want to distract from them. And this is where, certain addictive behaviors come in, like alcohol, misusing alcohol, drugs, scrolling, whatever. It's because we don't like being with our own thoughts. So my suggestion to you, watching this video, is think about what you are struggling with right now, whether or not it's low mood, depression, whether it's anxiety, whether it's overwhelm, and ask yourself, what thoughts are contributing to this? Do I have thoughts that produce anxiety? What are they? Are they thoughts about myself and my own abilities or my own appearance or my own social skills? I don't know, whatever, or my own work skills. Are they thoughts about what other people think about me? So when we start to notice our thoughts and we kind of watch them a little bit, this is where we start to be able to distance ourselves from them. It's called cognitive, which means thought diffusion. And when we have that space between, the thought and observing the thought, we start to cut off the energy to the thought. And people often ask, how do I stop these thoughts? How do I change my thoughts? Now, our thoughts have neural structures in the brain. And as I said, we tend to think the same thoughts over and over and over again. And they have deep grooves. And as soon as we start to think a thought, automatically it will generate an emotional response and then prompt behavior. This is the schema pattern. So working with these patterns, we need to first start really looking at the thoughts and challenging the thoughts. And if you think about the thoughts, the fuel for these thoughts, what keeps these thoughts active is energy and attention. So if, for example, we're out and we start to think, that person's judging me, I don't look right, or I said the wrong thing. If we start to buy into those thoughts, if we start to engage with those thoughts, we are fueling them. We are deepening the grooves in the brain. So what we need to be able to do is catch ourselves thinking these thoughts and try to stop giving them energy. And the way that we do that is often to think an alternative thought. So it could be, if you're thinking, what if something bad happens? You think, well, what if something good happens? Or what if that person who I think is looking at me in a funny way is actually just anxious? So it's the ability to think something differently. But it's not easy at first because these old patterns, these old thoughts have deep neural pathways. And we need to basically thought block somehow. We need to be able to turn our energy and attention away from that thought and start telling ourselves a different story. And as with all neuroplastic change, it only happens through constant repetition. So we first need to, identify the thoughts that are playing into the struggles that we have or the challenges that we have. And then we need to develop an alternative thought, a possible different, alternative, and then repeat that over and over again so that we stop the energy going to those old habitual thoughts. So, as I said, think about, maybe spend some time of just taking a step back and going, what am I thinking here? Where have my thoughts been going the last hour? What do I tell myself? What stories am I telling myself? How do I even know that these stories are true? And what if they weren't true? And another, if you identify a thought or certain thoughts that you have repetitively, it could be oh, I'm such a bad person, I'm useless, or whatever, I'm an imposter, all of this stuff. Imagine what your life would be like if you didn't have that thought. And then you can kind of see how our thoughts shape our reality. And not only that, our thoughts can actually make us sick. Because if we are having certain thoughts that are constantly activating the amygdala and the stress response, constantly, if we're in states of agitation or restlessness or unease, we're in a fight, flight, survival response. And we will experience those survival emotions and changes to our immune system and to our digestive system, to our cardiovascular system. And these changes are only supposed to happen in times of real danger, physical danger. But when our thoughts are activating them, it can be chronic. And then over time, our adrenals can wear out, our immune system starts to fail, our digestive system becomes compromised. So you can see how our thoughts can also impact our physical health. So the first step forward, start to look at the thoughts that are playing into whatever it is that you're struggling with today.